All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this session on the comprehensive response to terrorism. I'm the moderator, David Rothkopf. As you can see, we've got an unusual and distinguished panel to discuss this issue of central importance to so many of us. On my far right here, we have David Cameron, who's leader of the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom. Beside him, we have Shaukat Aziz, who's the Prime Minister of Pakistan. On my left, we have Michael Chertoff, who's the United States Secretary of Homeland Security. And beside Michael, we have Gijs, Vries, who is the Counter-terrorism coordinator for the Council of the European Union in Brussels. We're going to have a session today in which we exchange some questions here for approximately 25 or 30 minutes, and then we're going to open the discussion to the floor. We're going to keep this conversational, but I just want you to keep in mind as you're listening to the first half of this session, the role that we hope that you're going to play in the second half of this session, and we hope that that's an active role. Throughout, this will be a session that benefits from brief questions and brief answers, so we can cover as much of the very considerable ground as we've got to cover. To frame this, I do want to point out something. The World Economic Forum has prepared a study on global risks, which I really do recommend that you take a look at. They've identified something in the nature of 30-plus areas of risk worldwide, and clearly high among these in the minds of the people who participated in preparing this study is terrorism, and that's why this panel was put together and given such a prominent place in the program. Terrorism means a lot of things to a lot of different people. I think putting the issue in perspective is useful, and one way to do that is to note that although we're 5 years into what the United States has declared as a war on terror, the first time the United States declared a war on terror was 25 years ago. George Bush was also in charge of it at the time, but it was Vice President George Bush in the administration of Ronald Reagan. So we've been grappling with these problems for more than a generation here. The interesting thing throughout is the nature of terrorism is changing, and the nature of the root causes of terrorism is changing. So what I hope to do here in the beginning is to deal with some of the root causes and the change in the nature, then talk a little bit about what we're doing about it, and then open it to questions. Clearly, Mr. Prime Minister, few people can be as close to the impact of terrorism or to its root causes as you can. I think you're the only person on this panel who's actually been directly impacted by an al-Qaeda attack. And clearly Pakistan is dealing with this issue on the very front lines. And so perhaps the first question to you is, how do you see the evolution of the root causes of terrorism as you're dealing with it on a daily basis?
Thank you. This is a very important subject, and if I may just dilate on it for a few minutes. First of all, terrorism is not clearly understood by many, and I'd like to just say a few things. First, that terrorism is not linked to any faith. It is a universal problem. It respects no borders, and to address terrorism, we have to approach it on two fronts. First, a security approach, which provides for preventive measures, etc., and I think we'll talk about that later. Second, what are the root causes? What creates a terrorist? Why do people blow themselves up? What motivates them? How do they get to that stage? And what should we do to address this issue? In my view, the major cause of terrorism is a feeling of deprivation, the root cause. Deprivation can manifest itself in many forms. Deprivation can mean lack of income, lack of a voice, lack of rights and human rights, lack of opportunity, and a feeling of hopelessness and neglect because of lack of dispute resolution. So when we are looking at the root causes of terrorism, all these need to be addressed. In terms of dispute resolution, there are many areas in the world which have issues and disputes which are nagging and have not been resolved. Palestine is one of them. There are many others. You have a situation in Iraq, you have a situation in Afghanistan and several other parts of the world where people feel they are not getting their rights. And this leads to extreme behavior. And when you have extreme behavior, then people go and do things which are irrational. Terrorism is no friend of anybody, and let me at the outset say that terrorism is not linked to any faith. Islam, for example, is a religion of peace, harmony, and understanding. It is against the religion of Islam to create or conduct any terrorist acts. But many in the world link the two. So we have to address the root causes. We have to go deep into why people are feeling disempowered. Lack of income is one reason, for example. If you have people with nothing to eat, empty bellies, they become a hunting ground for those who want to create trouble. In the war against terror, the key players are the motivators and people who get people to behave in an extreme way. So we have to attack on many fronts. The funding of terrorism, the conversion of the minds of people from rational people to irrational people, linkage to faith, and we really must face facts that lingering disputes over long periods of time have to be addressed. As a result of what has happened in the world, there are now various measures on the security front to fight terrorism. Profiling of people, probably a reasonable thing to do in some environments, but has created a big reaction in people because they were otherwise normal. Now they are treated differently when they land at an airport. That creates more heartburn. So, there are a lot of complexities, but once again, the root causes must be addressed. You cannot avoid them, and that means a serious effort for dispute resolution. And if you look at terrorism in the world, it is not the exclusive preserve of any piece of geography or any particular faith. Every continent in the world has had some form of terrorism in the past. I won't name everybody or name every region, but if you look around, you will see that wherever there were disputes, wherever there was a feeling of deprivation and neglect, people reacted. The disputes were resolved, the terrorism disappeared. This can happen again. But there must be a will to resolve those issues, a will to confront the obvious, and then, coupled with security measures, we can find a lasting solution to this menace, which incidentally no person is immune from, no country is immune from. This is now a global phenomenon, and we have to look at it as a collective problem for all of us. That is what is happening, but more can be done, and perhaps we'll talk about that.
No, we certainly will. Secretary Chertoff, I recall when the position of Secretary of Homeland Security was created, it struck me that this was almost inevitably going to become one of the most thankless jobs in government, because if you did it very successfully, no one would ever hear of you or your successes, and that any one of your failures would be magnified, and then you would become the center of attention. And certainly, you've gotten to face this up close. One of the real challenges in that context, however, it seems to me, is this changing nature of terrorism. And it has two dimensions that resonate coming out of the comments of the Prime Minister. One is on the root cause side. We talk about profiling, but isn't the profile evolving in ways that's more challenging and difficult to deal with? And secondly, the stakes are changing. So you can improve by orders of magnitude your ability to stop terror, but if the impact of any individual terrorist act gets that much larger, your relative successes will be outweighed by the consequences of one problem. Can you talk about those two things briefly?
I think you're quite right. And let me begin by talking about what's at stake, because I think unless you look at the dimensions of the threat, it's hard to have a discussion about what's appropriate and what's inappropriate. What we face in the 21st century is the ability of even a single individual, and certainly a group, to leverage technology in a way to cause a type of destruction and a magnitude of destruction that would have been unthinkable a century ago. And that's only going to get worse. So when you consider the prospect of a small group fabricating a weapon of mass destruction with potentially catastrophic loss of life, if you even look at September 11th and the magnitude of the injury, you have to ask yourself whether that requires us to recalibrate the measures we take, because the risk of failure becomes that much greater. I think any rational person would be willing to do more to prevent a nuclear bomb from detonating than they would be prepared to do perhaps to prevent one person from being shot. So the stakes are increasingly becoming higher and higher as the technology increases. At the same time, I agree we don't want to be counterproductive. So we take an approach that I describe as risk management, not an effort to eliminate all risk, because that's not possible, and because even if it were possible, the cost in our civil liberties and our economic losses would be very, very substantial. But rather an attempt to identify those events that would be the high consequence events, focus our efforts at eliminating or minimizing the risk of those events, and then tailoring our approach by asking about the trade-offs. What's the right cost that we're prepared to incur in order to get the benefit of preventing that high consequence event? It does require that we take certain measures that will be inconvenient, requires us to sacrifice some elements of our economic activity, but hopefully not too much, and requires us to make some adjustments even in the way we conceive of our liberties. The key is not to do too much and to go overboard.
Okay, thank you. David, you are clearly grappling with many of the issues that Secretary Chertoff referred to in the United Kingdom. And when you combine the issue of root cause with the objective of containing the threat within society, you run up against a whole set of thorny issues about the nature of society, about the nature of law, the nature of freedom, and where one draws the line. How do you feel the United Kingdom is doing right now in striking that balance, and how, if in any way, would you alter the balance from the way it's being approached now?
I think what we need is we've got to get right the hard-nosed defence of liberty rather than a sort of ineffective authoritarianism. That's my worry, is that sometimes we can lunge into an ineffective authoritarianism if we're not very careful. It's, as Secretary Chertoff says, the stakes are so high that we've got to get our thinking really clear. And I think the first point, which he said is absolutely right, is we've got to understand the nature of this threat. That the terrorism we face today is, by a quantum, different from the IRA or the Red Brigade or Baader-Meinhof. This is terrorism where people want to kill as many as possible in one go, in the most spectacular way, using whatever weapons they can get hold of, and not only not mind killing themselves at the same time, but they seek martyrdom in doing so. So it is a different order of terrorism, and we have to understand that before even taking the next step of asking, well, what are the changes we make? And it seems to me that leads to the second point, is to recognise there are some big changes we have to make. I think the US, the UK, Pakistan, the EU, we've all recognised that. But when we make those changes, it's vital we get this balance right, that we don't lurch into an ineffective authoritarianism. We've got to be very strong in combating terrorism, but equally strong in defending liberty, democracy, the things that we are actually fighting for. In terms of how we then go about it, I think what the Pakistan Prime Minister has said is right. Of course we have to understand the motivation and the causes of terror. But even before that, I think we have to be clear in our minds that you cannot appease or find a list of demands that will stop an Osama bin Laden doing what he wants to do. There's no list of demands that you could sign up to or agree to that even exists that would make these terrorists stop. So that makes you realise that the security response has to be the first response, and we have to focus as governments and as oppositions on that point first. And then we have to ask, right, how do we further drain the swamp that is leading to the recruitment of terrorists? And while I agree with the Prime Minister that there are causes of deprivation, both in terms of material deprivation and other sorts of deprivation, I would say probably the most important in terms of understanding the causes is understanding some of the ideological causes, that there is a perversion of Islam that is being put about by these terrorists, by certain preachers, by certain individuals that we have to get to grips with and deal with. And that is where, in my view, while some of the new terrorist legislation we've introduced is important, we're not actually doing enough to recognise that young people are being radicalised by false prophets, if you like. And these people need, in the case of Britain, they need to be deported or arrested or what have you. And I think the clarity of thinking is what will make the difference between success in this endeavour and failure. And that is absolutely the key.
All right. Thank you very much. Mr. De Vries, as we grapple with this, one of the problems is sort of the complexity of overlapping jurisdictions. You've got to deal up and down the line within a country from the local most level to the national level, and then, as in your particularly complex case, among a large group of countries, and then above that with countries like the United States and Pakistan and others who are involved because this is a global enterprise. And in some respects, you know, in a conference which is discussing globalization, terrorism is an interesting case study because you have a whole host of institutions to deal with this, but none of them are global. They must deal in a kind of cooperation and improvisation that we've never grappled with before. And you have a unique perspective. I was wondering what your take was.
Well, clearly your first line of defense is national. You have to get your national institutions right, your national law enforcement right, and that means cooperation between all relevant services, bringing down the barriers between intelligence communities, police communities, the judicial authorities, your customs officers, your fiscal authorities, and so on. What the European Union has done is to engage in a peer review of how the countries of the EU cope with terrorism domestically, and issued a series of recommendations how that domestic coordination can improve. As a result, for example, a country like Belgium has decided to create a national centre for threat assessment, which it didn't have before, and improve the capabilities of its law enforcement officials to engage under strict conditions in telephone interception. So this is one example how international cooperation can help countries improve their defences. But if you move up to a higher level, there are perhaps two other levels. One is the regional level, where the European Union has been trying to break down legal barriers to cross-border cooperation. As a result, we now have about 1,000 terrorists and other criminal suspects a year which are being extradited across EU borders on the basis of a European arrest warrant. There are many other examples. But the third level is that of the UN, the global level. We do have a global institution. That's the United Nations. It has stepped up its activity, but more can be done. The UN has agreed 13 major pieces of legislation against certain acts of terrorism, against terrorist financing, for example. Terrorists need money. We have to make it more difficult for them to find that money. We have a global convention against terrorist financing, but many countries in the world have not yet ratified and implemented that. And that's really something where all of us can help, and where even participants at this conference and in this meeting could help. Of these global conventions, half of the world's nations have not yet ratified and implemented all. So members of this conference could help by talking to their national governments about ratification and implementation of these global instruments. We need to fight terrorism globally. It's a global threat. Let them all make sure that we implement these global instruments.
Let me follow up that with a couple of questions. We're going to turn it to you in 5 to 10 minutes, so please get your questions ready. But just following up on that particular point, one of the global institutions that's most critical to all of this has been the Nonproliferation regime. Clearly, with what's been happening in Iran, with what's been happening in North Korea, and recent news about collaboration between North Korea and Iran, the threat of proliferation is growing more extreme, particularly with Iran's role as the world's leading state sponsor of terror. And yet the Nonproliferation regime isn't working. Is it time for NPT 2.0?
You know, I think first of all, again, to put it in context, what is at stake when you deal with the proliferation of nuclear weapons is the possibility of an outcome that would be several orders of magnitude beyond anything we've experienced up to now. And you can't put that genie back in the bottle. Once a weapon of mass destruction or a nuclear bomb gets in the hands of a terrorist, you're not going to be able to reclaim that, and it's going to transform the way in which we live. I think the issue becomes not necessarily creating new bureaucratic structures or signing new agreements or new documents, but at some point exerting the will to impose consequences on those state actors or non-state actors who are unwilling to comply with the rules as they currently are. And this is really what we're coming up to now, is an international test about whether we are willing to take the steps we need to take now before that genie gets out of the bottle. And it may be that one can adjust or change or augment some of the existing regimes and agreements, but at the end of the day, if those who are trafficking in this activity don't take seriously our will to enforce the rules, all the paperwork in the world is not going to make a difference.
How can they take seriously our will if the proliferation seems to be happening in the way that it is?
Well, I think we're facing some issues now with respect to sanctions for actors that do not comply with the existing regimes that are going to test whether the nations of the world are prepared to do what they need to do, including making a certain amount of sacrifice of their own business interests in order to enforce the rules and visit consequences on states that don't comply with the rules. And that's not to say you don't discuss, but at some point there's got to be a little bit of stick behind this, or else it becomes a lot of empty words.
Okay. I want to come back to you in 1 minute, Mr. Prime Minister, but following up on Mr. de Vries' point, in the UK you're grappling with how to structure this right now, and I was just wondering, I know there's some thoughts about dividing up government agencies, creating new government agencies. You've watched what's happened in the United States. You've watched the steps taken in your own government. What's the national solution that makes the most sense?
Well, Secretary Chertoff and I were talking about this before coming in, and his advice was, once you've got a good set of institutions, make them work and don't keep chopping and changing. And I think that's right. Under discussion in the UK at the moment is the idea of splitting our Home Office, our Interior Ministry, into two, a Ministry of Justice on the one hand and Immigration and Prisons and Policing on the other. I don't think that's a good idea. I think what's needed is better administration, better coordination, and that to me means inside your Home Office, inside your Interior Department, having two senior ministers, one who can focus on policing and criminal justice and the traditional Home Office matters, and one who is a counter-terrorism minister, who sits in cabinet at the highest level of government and who can be the coordinator. I think the approach of trying to create a separate department to counter-terrorism, I don't think is the right approach. And if I have a criticism of the way the government in the UK has been going about counter-terrorism, I think there's been too much focus on law and not enough focus on good administration. We've had, of course, we needed some new terrorism legislation. We needed some new offences to be created. But we've had new law after new law after new law, but not, I would argue, a sufficient focus on actually building up the security services, making sure they've got the right resources, changing things that really need to be changed so you can get to grips with terrorism. For instance, having a separate terrorism minister who sits at the cabinet. So I think you've got to get the balance right between, yes, passing laws, but also effective administration, and I don't think we've got that right.
Okay. I'm going to come to you folks in a second, so please be ready. Mr. Prime Minister, as I said at the beginning, no country faces so many dimensions of the terrorist threat, the terrorism phenomenon, both in its local and in its global incarnations as Pakistan. And the average citizen viewing the war on terror, particularly since 9/11, must have some mixed emotions wherever they are in the world. On the one hand, there's been some clear progress, and certainly certain kinds of attacks have been forestalled. On the other, new kinds have emerged. On the one hand, Osama bin Laden remains at large. The Taliban seem to be resurgent, and clearly this poses a threat not only in Pakistan and in Afghanistan, but worldwide. Sure. And on the other, there must be some successes that you can point to internally. And I'm just wondering how, were you to sit in front of the average citizen of the average country, you can counterbalance the fears that we're unable to get the world's most wanted man when he lives within a few hundred square miles of an area that we roughly have some idea about, and at the same time give them some sort of semblance of hope that we're making some progress.
Yeah, there were many questions in that statement. As regards Pakistan's role vis-a-vis terrorism, as I mentioned earlier, we naturally are committed to fighting it because of our conviction that terrorism is no solution to any dispute and issue. And that's why I mentioned the root causes. We should not, while we take a security approach, and that's essential, and we all are doing that, the ultimate solution will come when the root causes are resolved. Having said that, Pakistan, because of geography, has got involved in this whole issue, but has also tackled it, in our view, very effectively. Today, if you come to Pakistan, the hotels are full, the economy is booming, our growth rates are 7 to 8%, airlines are full, and hotel lobbies are full of foreigners. So the country has moved beyond many of the challenges which have existed in the past. How did we do it? We took a very determined decision that we are going to fight this menace very effectively. So when Afghanistan became turbulent, many of the people ran across the border. There's a huge porous border, and we have caught more of these people than any other country in the world, as you know, hundreds of them. Now, because our intelligence and security services are very effective, they don't want to come to our place. Because why should they come here when there are many countries where there is no writ? They can just hide somewhere and nobody bothers them. As regards some of the names you mentioned, the truth is that nobody knows where they are. If anybody knew where they are, the system, the world would go after them. And in Pakistan's case, we have, every country has their own way of doing things. We have created various organizations, or got them together actually, to create synergy in this effort to fight terrorism. And we feel good in the sense that we've been very successful. And the number of incidents in Pakistan has reduced dramatically. The flow of people has reduced because the terrorist knows that if they come across the border, they will be caught. Having said that, why are terrorists being created, say in Afghanistan? You talked about the Taliban. Pakistan believes that the solution lies in Afghanistan. If the people there have income, if they have a reason to live, they have hope for a better future, the drug production is stopped, because we didn't talk about financing too much, but the nexus of drug production and terrorism is a very dangerous nexus. That is what we see in Afghanistan. Today, Afghanistan is the largest supplier of drugs to Europe. And this money goes somewhere. The money comes into the system and then is used for activities prejudicial to the country and the rest of the world. So we have to tackle each problem and in a disciplined way. That is what Pakistan has done. Pakistan's success in dealing with this threat is because we were determined. There was leadership. The President and the Prime Minister and the government were very committed to fighting it. There was no question of ifs and buts, because we believe that this is a threat for not just Pakistan but the whole world. We have cooperated with many countries. We have close cooperation because, as you alluded to, this is a cross-border issue now. Nobody can build a fortress in their country and hope that that will never be penetrated. So we have to exchange intelligence. It has to be 24/7. You can't wait for the weekend to be over to contact. Terrorists don't wait for that. So all that has been done to position the world to fight this threat better. Now, what does Pakistan want? For example, in our neighborhood, we want a vibrant, progressive, safe Afghanistan. That is in our strategic interest. because we have 1,700 miles of border. If they get destabilized, we will pay a big price. That's why we want this issue to be resolved. I mentioned there's terrorism in the Middle East. I mentioned Iraq. I mentioned Palestine. I mentioned Lebanon, etc. We need to address why this is happening and get the issues on the table, get the stakeholders in the room and address. Otherwise, if you just take the security approach, it'll get you results, but it won't be sustainable. And that's really the essential message we want to share with the world, that work on a dual track. Security must be the best, state of the art, and incidentally, in all cases where terrorists have been nabbed, technology has played a major part. We must invest in the best technology and go after it. And lastly, on the root causes and dispute resolution, the world needs to move faster. These are complex disputes, we realize them. But tomorrow, if Afghanistan gets settled, we will benefit. Today, even today, with the improvement in the economy of Afghanistan, our trade is $1.5 billion. It used to be $25 million 5 years ago. So we have a vested interest in their success, and we will work closely with them and anybody else who's fighting this menace, because really, by doing that, we are helping ourselves and the world at large.
Okay, thank you very much. Let us turn to questions from the floor. I'd like to ask, this will be the first question here. I see several others. I'd like to ask this gentleman here. Please give your name. Keep the question fairly brief, and we'll then get a couple of responses here and move out to the next question. Yes, sir.
Karim Kawar. We have been involved with the largest deployment of an IRIS database of 10 million people. 120,000 people have been captured that have been deported. The question is, what is the role of technology and biometrics in specific in fighting terrorism, and what are the various governments doing in this regard? Thank you.
All right, let's get a couple of quick responses, and since I only went to Mr. Vries once, I'm going to start with you.
Well, clearly biometrics can play a role. It can play a role, for example, in making our passports more secure. We need to move from the old generation of passports where pictures are glued that can easily be falsified and have given rise, frankly, to a huge industry of identity fraud, to a new generation where we include biometric features in passports. So in the European Union, we are working to include a facial scan and fingerprints, and obviously the technology allows for further development. That way we will make it more difficult for people to engage in identity fraud. We need to go beyond that, however. Just to widen the question a little bit, but to stick with the example of passports, what's essential is that we create a global database of all the lost and stolen passports that are sloshing about the world. Interpol has such a database. We need to feed that database. EU member states and the United States have agreed to put all our domestic information about lost and stolen passports to Interpol to create that global database. But many other countries have still to follow suit. And of course the second step is that you then have to allow your police forces access to that database and your border authorities so that they can use that global tool to protect their countries. But yes, I think biometrics can play an important role. There are privacy issues there. They must also be addressed. As David Cameron has just rightly said, it's important to preserve civil liberties in the fight against terrorism. That's a wider point, the human rights issue, to which perhaps we can return, because I believe that is absolutely fundamental to a long-term success. But biometrics is a key component of the overall approach.
Let me just add that there is a huge tool that we have in the area of biometrics, which is your fingerprint. We're moving to a regime now where we are able not only to use the fingerprint as a way of identifying somebody who we may have a record about as a known terrorist, but to use the fingerprint as a way of identifying unknown terrorists. Those of you who watch television and television shows about forensic crime fighting know that often people leave fingerprints, latent fingerprints, at the scene of a crime. It's also the case they leave them at safe houses or in training camps. We collect those biometrics, we collect those latent prints, and by using the fingerprint with respect to people who are traveling across our borders, we can now begin to match those travelers against people whose identities we may not know about, but who have in fact trained in a terrorist training camp or been in a safe house building bombs. That kind of capability, if we can make it international, will dramatically raise the cost to terrorists who want to travel around the world.
Do either of you want to respond briefly to this?
Yes. Pakistan has done 4 things, which I'll just list them for your benefit. First of all, we've changed all our passports from the old glued passports to machine readable. That is a major change. And coupled with this, we have installed a system of immigration, centralized, automated, which covers all our border points, technology system. Secondly, we have national ID cards of almost 50 million people, maybe more, actually. A state-of-the-art system which identifies everybody, and there's a central database for that too. Very effective, very useful when we are investigating people. Third, for Afghan refugees, we have 3 million of them. We are giving them biometric cards so that they are identified, and gradually we hope that they will go away. Also, we have just issued and are issuing biometric cards for local nationals who live on the border, who have easement rights and go back and forth, meaning living in one country on the Pakistan side, working in Afghanistan, or vice versa. And lastly, an area which we think is crucial is for security and intelligence work. We all need state-of-the-art equipment to intercept communications, which can then give us a lot of leads. We don't talk about this, but we have invested a lot in software and hardware to ensure that what has to be monitored must be monitored, in line with the laws of the country.
I just make a simple point, which is a warning, really. I mean, obviously, technology has a huge role to play in combating terrorism, whether it's closed-circuit television, whether it's biometrics. That's obviously the case. But I think we do have to be careful in not believing there's a sort of technological solution to all of this. For instance, our government is looking at a national identity database on which it's planning to put an enormous amount of information on individuals. And if you use one database for all the different bits of information about an individual, the risk of that being corrupted becomes greater because you're putting all your information eggs into one national database basket. So I think we do have to be careful about that. And while we're thinking of the complex technological things we can do, we shouldn't forget some of the very simple things that currently we aren't doing. I mean, in Britain, for instance, we don't yet have embarkation controls. We don't actually know who's left our country. Now, that is something that's a relatively simple piece of technology that would make a much bigger difference than maybe some of the Minority Report style excitements of the future. So get some of the simple things right, as well as looking at the technology for the future.
Okay, let's go to this woman about 4 or 5 rows back in the middle. We've got about 20 minutes, so quick questions and quick answers. We've got about 10 questions here, so let's...
My name is Lamis Al-Hadidi. I'm a journalist from Egypt, and my question is to Mr. Secretary. I heard you talk about non-proliferation policies, but I haven't heard you talking about Israel. Israel has admitted owning nuclear power. Israel did not sign the non-proliferation treaty in the region. Don't you think that the U.S. double standards in the region is one of the main causes of terrorism? Thank you.
I think it's very hard to isolate individual causes for terrorism, and I think it's often also the case that terrorists seize upon political issues that exist as a rationalization for terrorism. If we talk about bin Laden, I think bin Laden is a relative latecomer to dealing with some of the Middle Eastern issues as a cause for his grievances. If you go back early into the 1990s, he's tended to move around the rationalization for what he does. In fact, his ideology is an ideology that would drive the entire Middle East back to the 12th or 13th century with an autocratic style of government. To me, the number one non-proliferation issue now is, are we concerned about the possibility that terrorist groups who would use weapons of mass destruction are going to get their hands on those weapons? Because they will not be constrained by international rules or international law or deterrence or common sense. People who are willing to blow themselves up are not susceptible to the same kind of deterrence and reason that typically arises when we're dealing with state actors who behave in a more rational fashion. So I understand there are all kinds of different views about the current state of who has what in terms of technology. We are where we are. I think the critical issue is to keep these weapons out of the hands of irresponsible actors who can deliver them into the hands of those who would use them.
It strikes me listening to this that another way to frame that is that the old doctrine of mutually assured destruction only is effective as destruction is a bad outcome. Yeah. And that in this particular case, it's not for some people. Yes, sir, and the microphone is beside you.
Joe Nye, Harvard University. As we battle terrorism, we have to use the hard power of police and intelligence and the soft power of winning hearts and minds to prevent new recruitments. Last December, the British Foreign Office said that the words we use are undercutting our ability to prevent new recruitments. And in particular, the FCO said that no longer should British officials use the term war on terrorism, because as we used that term, we played into terrorists' own narrative that they were heroes in a holy war. I would like to ask Mr. Cameron whether he agrees with the FCO position, and then ask Secretary Chertoff whether he agrees with the British position.
And of course, gentlemen, I want to caution you that you're being asked about terminology and with regard to soft power from the guy who invented the term soft power. So you have to approach it with some caution as well.
And some humility. I do agree with the Foreign Office position. What we are up against is, yes, it is global. Yes, it requires massive international coordination. Yes, it is a struggle. Yes, at times it will require hard power and military force. But I think we have to be careful in the language that we use that we don't link up all the elements of conflict and problems in the world and actually help Osama bin Laden to win recruits. And if we're not careful in our use of language, we can actually do that. What we should be about is breaking up and dealing with all of the conflicts that can help recruit terrorists. Yes, we need to do more in terms of Israel-Palestine. Yes, we need to address the other issues that we know are out there that cause unease and hurt in Muslim communities around the world. But we shouldn't link them up in a way that Osama bin Laden wants us to. So yes, I do agree with that, and I think that combination of hard power and soft power is going to be absolutely vital in making sure we're successful in what I call, yes, it's a global struggle, but I think we should use our language carefully.
And Secretary Chertoff, you can now respond to Joe's provocation and desire to produce a rift in the special relationship.
Right. Well, let me begin by saying we've had such an outstanding relationship with the British, as exemplified by the very close cooperation we had last August with the airline plot, that nothing could sunder that relationship. I think the language turns out to be a very difficult problem. I do agree that the phrase war on terror is a tactic, it's a thing. And I think David was right earlier in saying we are dealing with an ideology. And if we don't recognize that, we actually make this more about the tools than we are about the animating forces. Now, how we describe that ideology is tricky, because I think we all recognize, and I'm not Muslim, but I accept that Islam is a peaceful religion and does not endorse this use of violence. I recognize that there are people who invoke Islam and claim to represent a style of Islam who do advocate for a militant ideology. And I frankly think one of the things we need to do is work with moderate members of the community to understand how they want to describe this ideology so we can be more precise in dealing with it.
There are several terms which we should be very careful in using. Another term which is used, in my view, flippantly is the term Islamic terrorism. There is no such thing. It suggests that terrorism is inherently Islamic, and as Prime Minister Aziz has said, that's nonsense. That's a separate issue, but language does matter. On the question of is there a war or not a war on terror, let's be very careful. with the conceptual framework we use in combating terrorism. If we are to win the hearts and minds, the key long-term issue of people in this fight, we need to work from common principles, principles that Muslims and non-Muslims can agree on. Those principles must be respect for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the human rights enshrined therein. That means that not everything is permitted in the fight against terrorism. The concept of a war may create a conceptual framework in which we think more is permitted than is wise if we want to win hearts and minds. For example, to use detention without trial or detention without charge, to use secret prisons, should not be acceptable in the fight against terrorism. Whether we call it a war or not, let us fight this fight within the bounds of human rights, because long term, that is the only way in which we will prevail.
Do you want to comment on this? I heard you nodding and cheering him on.
Actually, no. All I would say is I don't want to get into definitional issues between David's government or Britain and the United States or anybody else. I think the real issue is not what the average terrorist recruited by, say, Osama bin Laden doesn't read the Foreign and Commonwealth Office statement about war on terror. Let's get reality for a change. They are sitting in some remote area and being brainwashed, and they don't read statements or watch. I mean, let's be realistic, really, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen. The real issue is when people are recruited, whether we call it A or B or C, that's good in a discussion like this, but where the rubber meets the road, their motivation and their whole approach is when they recruit. We are being deprived, we are being wronged, our generations have been mistreated, so come join this effort. That's how they recruit. Nobody says, excuse me, there's a statement from the British Foreign Office. What do you think? I mean, let's get reality, please. That's all. Okay. No disrespect to the Foreign Office.
No, I think it's
Mr. Nai, who's a great educationist, and we respect him immensely.
Okay, let's stick with that. Let's stick to reality for the next two questions, which is all we have time for. This gentleman here, and then we'll go to this woman over here. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. To Mr.
Could you identify yourself?
Sorry, Hani al-Banna, President of Islamic Leaf UK. We have offices also in the US. And Mr. Chertoff, you mentioned it's going to get worse. Why is it not going to get better after 5 years or 6 years? This is one thing. The other question is, can we see one day that we are going to sit down with a terrorist group and have a dialogue instead of a war, like the British government did with the IRA before, and now they are a part of the political establishment of UK, of Ireland and UK? This is one thing. The other thing for Mr. Cameron, I'm British Muslim as well. Mr. Cameron, I think there's not much difference between the terrorism of IRA and the terrorism of Al-Qaeda, because both of them have indiscriminate killing. And if you remember, the Brighton bombing, which nearly killed Mrs. Thatcher in the early 80s, the Christmas bombing in London every year, and the Birmingham bombing, indiscriminate killing of innocent people by anybody. And the recent one in Spain by the ETA group even last month. So really there is no much difference between terrorism and terrorist groups. And we don't like, at the end of this meeting, to just associate terrorism with one religion, which is Islam. This could bring more hatred. And I thank Mr. De Vries, I hope that I pronounced your name rightly, of just making it clear, as this is our stand in the European Union, that actually terrorism does not have a country, does not have a religion, does not have a race. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And let's get brief answers there, and then we've got so many questions here, I'd like to make sure we've only got 7 minutes to go.
Well,
go ahead.
Let me answer. I'll answer the first question first. What I said I thought was going to get worse was the technology, which is going to give leverage to people, and I just think it's the march of technology. I mean, it's we now have nuclear weapons, we have biological things that didn't exist 100 years ago. I'm going to take a leaf out of what the Prime Minister said. Let's get real and have reality. Bin Laden has told us what his demands are, which are basically the defeat of the West. This is not a case where we don't even have to get to the question of dealing with a circumstance where someone says, well, I have some concrete things I want you to do. I've got a particular grievance. His grievance is an existential grievance. He's told us what he wants. He wants to go back to the 12th century. So I don't think there's an issue of discussion with al-Qaeda and bin Laden, and it strikes me, as the Prime Minister says, not to be a real issue at this point.
I think what Michael said is absolutely right. That's the big difference between the IRA and al-Qaeda, is bin Laden's demands, such as there are any. It is to go back to a medieval caliphate. He wouldn't be satisfied even if you drove every last Israeli into the Mediterranean. I mean, it is different. I'm not in any way belittling what the IRA did. They did appalling atrocities in Northern Ireland, on the mainland of the United Kingdom. Everyone in British politics has friends or fellow MPs or people they knew and loved, me included, who were victims of terrorism, who were murdered. So we feel incredibly strongly about this. But it does seem to me, to get this debate right, we have to understand there is a difference of degree between the appalling IRA terrorism that we suffered for many years and what is happening now, which is the difference partly because it is suicide bombing. People strapping bombs to themselves, getting on the London Underground, blowing up and killing 52 British citizens. That is a different sort of terrorism, and I think we would be betraying our own populations if we didn't recognise that and act on it. But as I said, we've got to act on it in a way that is both strong and tough against terrorism, but also strong and tough in defence of liberty and democracy and our way of life and all of the things that Guy de Vries spoke about as well. But the IRA and al-Qaeda are different, and we should recognise that.
Do you want to say something briefly here?
Very, very briefly. Just to draw the audience's attention on one dimension which we mentioned but haven't focused on, which is what are we doing, or are we doing enough to reduce that sense of hopelessness which people have, which causes them to be recruited by these people. Empowerment on the economic side. If somebody has a prosperous life, a better future, etc., the probability of them falling into this trap will be reduced. That doesn't mean it will never happen. But I think my view and our view is the world is not focusing enough on giving people a sense of a better future in areas where they are prone to these. Are they marginalized communities? Are they people who have no future? They are even there's one issue of political disputes. The other is a better life. And frankly, the world hasn't done enough of it. We in Pakistan have benefited from improvement in the economy and the better prospects for the people. But you take some of the other countries, they have nowhere to go. So they feel a greater, immense sense of hopelessness, which then becomes the breeding ground for elements who are trying and looking for these young people who will blow themselves up. And the world hasn't done enough on it, and that's what I just wanted to say to the audience.
No, it's not entirely without resonance that the closing gala here has a Malaysian theme, and that the way that the British tackled terrorism in the Malaysian peninsula, in which they both went after terrorists and cultivated growth and jobs, absolutely, which ultimately led to the evolution of the current modern Malaysian state, is an example that's often lost in this. There is a woman here who's been patient. This is the last question. Keep it brief, and let's keep the answers brief.
Thank you. My name is Irene Khan, and I'm head of Amnesty International, a human rights organization. Now, I can only applaud what some of the panelists have said about not sacrificing human rights in the name of terrorism. However, to take a leaf out of Mr. Aziz's presentation, let's look at reality. And the reality is UK, US, Pakistan, and EU member states have all actively, in seeking to counter terrorism, have actually eroded fundamental human rights standards, including such basic ones as prohibition of torture, not having secret prisons, and so on. So my question to all the panelists is, to what extent do you believe that undermining fundamental principles of justice and human rights in the name of counter-terrorism actually feeds the flames of terrorism, particularly when they're targeting some communities in a very discriminatory manner, and rather than actually staunching the flames of terrorism?
All right, this is going to be the last question and also the last answer. Let's start with you, Mr. De Vries. We'll work our way down, but I just want you to know it's your last chance for a comment because we have to wrap up in 3 minutes.
I agree with Mrs. Khan that it's absolutely essential that we stick to the fundamental principles that we have pledged to uphold. That is not always easy, and it's not always being done consistently. I think there are a couple of bottom line issues here. One is the interdiction of torture. Torture is illegal in war and in peace. Not just a little bit of torture can be allowed, it must be stopped. And that basically means stick to the principle of non-refoulement, not sending people back to countries where they run a serious risk of being tortured. The European Court of Human Rights has issued some guidelines to that extent. EU member states should stick to that. That's essential. Secondly, let's be very careful with freedom of expression. There are many countries in the world where a case can be made, and indeed Amnesty has made that case, that the rights of peaceful opponents of the government in power have been infringed by invoking arguments to do with the fight against terrorism. That may increase a sense of powerlessness, a sense of alienation that can in certain circumstances feed terrorism. That is precisely why we have to be careful in defending the right to free speech, allowing therefore certain risks. But what is not acceptable is to call for violence. Incitement to violence is illegal and must be stamped out wherever it occurs.
Okay. It's a huge issue, and I regret having to emphasize that we only have 3 minutes or 2 minutes.
I think I would say that I agree that we should not sacrifice fundamental human rights. I think it's important also, though, not to treat every departure from the ordinary set of rules that we use in criminal cases as a catastrophic departure from fundamental human rights. We have to be precise about what truly is fundamental and what isn't fundamental, and there is sometimes a tendency to regard things that may be a departure from what we do in a simple criminal case as if it is a fundamental betrayal of what we believe in. It is a difficult adjustment. There are also some differences, legal differences among countries in terms of what we consider to be more important or less important. Americans, for example, put a great deal of store in the jury trial. Most European countries don't have a jury trial. We accept that that's a difference in approach, but not one that's fundamental. I think in terms of how it impacts the war on terror, obviously, first of all, I totally agree we should not be discriminatory based on people's religion or ethnic group. Where we approach the issue of separating people who are threats from those who aren't threats, it should be based on behavior. But again, we have to be realistic, and frankly, the tools that we need to identify the kind of behavior we have to worry about are tools that require us to gather information. And often some of the critics who say, well, you should be behavior-based, also are critical of intelligence gathering that they view as an invasion of privacy. We are going to have to come to a sustainable approach to this that safeguards fundamental liberties but doesn't regard every security measure as inherently a civil liberties problem.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister.
Thank you. Let me first say that on Ms. Irene Khan's comments, clearly I think we'll all agree that it goes without saying human rights have to be respected. In our case, we have passed legislation to put the guidelines on dealing with terrorism, and we have anti-terrorist legislation which gives the guidelines to our judiciary. May I also say that Pakistan is proud to have a very free press, print and electronic media. We have 50 private TV channels, and the print media is also proliferating, which is a healthy trend, many of whom are represented here today. Next, on the judiciary, we are also very pleased and privileged that our judiciary is independent, and if there is evidence that the laws have been transgressed, the judiciary gives a very tough word. In the end, let me just say that the issue of terrorism, as we said earlier, is not linked to any geography, any faith. It is a mindset we are dealing with. This mindset can get into any society, and what we have to work on is to mend the hearts and minds of the people. This is a much more complex issue than just a security issue. Winning the hearts and minds of the people needs good leadership, good policies, clear vision of how this has to be handled, and definitely in this, we have to understand the root causes of why people behave in a certain way. All this put together, I think we are dealing with this threat collectively as the world, but we must always remember that unless we attack the fundamental reasons of this behavior, we will always be vulnerable for it reoccurring. It can be handled, it will be handled, but we need to work together and work on many fronts concurrently.
David.
My answer would be to say, of course we have to defend the fundamental freedoms that we have. That was part of what I said in my opening remarks. But there are some areas where, in order to defeat terrorism, we have to seek a balance. Let's take the example of how long you can detain a suspect before they go in front of a court. We've had a very big debate about this in Britain. It's now gone from 14 days to 28 days. There are some strict controls over it, but when you're trying to break up complicated plots, when you're dealing with suicide bombers, I think the idea that you may need to hold suspects for a little longer before they go in front of a court is probably right. It's a balance. It should be debated openly. Gijs Vries made the point that we should stick to fundamental principles, like not sending people to countries where we know they're going to be tortured. Yes, of course, but if we actually look at what is happening in terms of the way our courts are interpreting the European Convention on Human Rights, whereas 10 years ago, when we had human rights, of course, but 10 years ago, the Home Secretary could consider what is the risk to Britain if this person who I think may be very dangerous stays, and what is the risk to them if they are returned to their country of origin. He could weigh up in the balance what the dangers were. Today, because of the jurisprudence and the legal cases, you can't even take that into account. So what we've had to do in Britain is then pass a series of laws to imprison people for long periods of time without having a trial. How has that really protected and grown our human rights? I would argue it hasn't. It is better, actually, to have some common sense in the application of human rights rather than the vast extensions in terms of the jurisprudence that we've seen recently.
Nothing like this last issue underscores the sensitivity and complexity of the issues associated with terrorism. I think that today's discussion also underscores that not only is this a large issue, but it's one that will be with us for a long time to come, and for which having debates like this here within the forum is extremely useful, and therefore I hope that all of you will participate in these in future iterations of the forum. Please join me in thanking this excellent panel for this lively discussion.